Compound words in Chinese can look confusing at first, but once you see the patterns, learning and remembering them becomes much easier. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode we are going to continue talking about words, and this is part of my series on the building blocks of Chinese. And to get a quick overview of the previous articles, I suggest you check the link in the description where you can check out the written version, which also has links to all the previous articles and episodes. In last week's episode, we talked about words in Chinese, and we discussed what the difference is between a character and a word and a phrase, and why this matters. The main takeaway here is that you need to understand that words don't work the same way in Chinese as they do in English, and that has an impact on how you're learning them, not just because it makes it easier to remember them once you realize that they consist of meaningful components, but also because sometimes you actually really need to know the individual characters in order to use the words properly. Today we are going to look at compound words and see how the components in these words relate to each other, both in terms of structure, so kind of the internal grammar of words, if you will, and also in terms of what they mean, so how the different components' meanings relate to each other. And all of these things will make it easier to decipher Chinese words. It will also make it a lot easier to remember them and, for example, figuring out which order the characters are supposed to come in case that is not obvious. The goal here is rather practical. I want to help you break the code and kind of get into the internal workings of words and see how they are composed of smaller, meaningful parts. And that really will accelerate your learning, especially once you learned those building blocks so you can just combine them. Because as we have seen before, combining things you know is much easier than learning completely new things. Before we begin, I should also say that this is, of course, a simplification of how these things work. It's actually quite complicated, and there are many different theories of how words work in Chinese. And my goal here is not to provide you with material for your term paper in Chinese linguistics, because I think most of you are not writing such a paper. Instead, the goal is to help you learn the language. But if you are interested, I have provided links to further reading and references in the written article that comes with this podcast. So the first thing we're going to look at is the internal structure of words. And here I want to say a few things about English first, so we can use something we're more familiar with, and then we can apply that to Chinese. So one word that we haven't mentioned so far in the previous episode, for example, is morpheme, and that is usually defined as the smallest meaningful lexical unit. So you can think of it as the smallest thing that means something in the language. And this is of course not the same as a word. For example, in English we have a word like hunters, which has 3 morphemes in it. We have hunt, which is the root of the word, so that's a morpheme. Then we have that we add to that signifies that this is a person doing this, it's a hunter. And then we have s at the end, so hunters, which means that more than one person doing it, it's plural, right? So we have 3 morphemes that form one word. You can probably feel that these morphemes are a little bit different because, for example, hunt is a word you can use on its own. You can form sentences with it and you can imagine what it is. But if you take something like that doesn't mean anything. You cannot say, hey, there's an over there. It's just something we append to a word like hunt to make it a person that does this thing. So hunter. And the same with s. So these latter 2 kinds of morphemes are called bound morphemes, which means that they are bound together with a root of some kind, otherwise they can't really appear in the language. Of course, in English we can also have words that have more than one free morpheme in them. So for example, blackbird, wheelchair, and football all consist of 2 free morphemes that can, on their own, be used to mean something else and can be used as words independently. This is not the Hacking English podcast, so let's turn to Chinese now, knowing that a morpheme then is the smallest meaningful unit. And many of the words that we looked at in the previous episode are actually composed of 2 free morphemes. So for example, 大家, 你好, and 吃饭, which mean everybody, hello, and to eat, respectively, are all composed of free morphemes. So for example, 你 and 好 can be used separately, and indeed we actually saw that this was treated as a phrase and not a word in the previous episode. And as I said last week, this debate about what is a word, what is a phrase, and so on is rather complicated, and it's not something I'm going to talk about again here, but just note that many words actually do have free morphemes that can be used independently, but that it can be rather tricky to figure this out. Let's look at some other words we looked at in last week's episode. So we had 大衣, which meant overcoat. We have 足球, which means football. And then we had 睡觉, which means to sleep. So looking closer at da I, we can of course say that da can be used on its own. That's not very strange. It's a very simple way of saying big. But I really can't be used as its own word. It is very common inside of other words, so it's very useful to know that it means clothes, but you have to pair it up with something else, such as ifo, and that means clothes, or shui pajamas, or maybe ci laundry. So this is a morpheme because it still carries meaning here. It means something, but it can't be used independently on its own, so it appears in these compounds giving this meaning of clothes. In the second example, zu qiu, we can see that qiu can of course be used on its own to mean ball, but zu in modern Mandarin is not really used to mean foot very often. It can be used, but it sounds very technical, maybe in an anatomy textbook or something like that. But if you want to refer to just foot, you don't say zu, you say jiao normally. So this is borderline between being a free and a bound morpheme depending on what kind of register or which part of the language you're talking about. And then in the third example, 睡觉, we can see that 睡 is a verb that can of course be used on its own and is often used on its own. But that 觉 really only appears as the object of 睡. So you can say things like 睡不了觉. So you separate them a bit like we talked about last time, but they still belong together and you can't just use 觉 on its own to mean sleep. In Chinese, there are also some words that only have bound morphemes in them, which means that none of the parts can actually be used on their own, but they are only form a word when they are used together. So one such example is 玻璃, which means glass, and you can't just use 玻 or 璃 separately to mean glass. You have to use them together, and then only they mean glass. Or we have many animal words like, for example, butterfly, 蝴蝶. You need to use them together, only then do they mean butterfly. Well, the characters individually might mean that, but they can't be used independently to mean butterfly. So to summarize what we have seen so far, we have 4 different types of compounds in Mandarin. And these relate to the status of the morphemes that are involved. Are they free or are they bound? So we have compounds that have 2 free morphemes, and that would be 吃饭, for example. They can be used independently. We also have free plus bound. That would be words like 睡觉, where 睡 can be used on its own, but not 觉. In this category, we also have words that have a root and then some kind of suffix added to it. And for example, you probably know words like 杯子, cup, or 桌子, table, and we have this z thing added at the end, and that is also, of course, a bound morpheme. We will get back to these suffixes later. We also have the opposite, where we have a bound morpheme plus a free morpheme, so that would be 足球, for example. And here we also have the opposite of what I said with suffixes, with prefixes. So there are many words in Chinese, of course, that have a prefix of some kind and then a root follows that. So for example, we have the word 初, which means the beginning or the start of something, and we can then use this as a prefix in other words. So for example, 初稿 would mean the first draft of, say, an article or something. And then in the fourth category, we have 2 bound morphemes together, such as in 玻璃. Naturally, not all words are 2 syllables in Mandarin, but by covering these, we cover a vast majority of cases, and this logic can also be applied to longer words. So let's continue by looking at the internal structure of some of these compounds. And the key takeaway here is that the structure of compounds generally follows the same principles as Chinese phrases do. And you don't need to be a linguist or have a deep understanding of Chinese grammar to be able to appreciate this. So let's look at a few examples how this works with nouns first. So in most nouns, the main formant or the kind of core noun is on the right. So that means in a word like 足球, which consists of 2 nouns, right? We have foot and then ball. Ball is the word we are describing here, and 足 describes what kind of ball it is. The same is true for 大衣, where we have the formant noun on the right. So 衣 here, clothes, is the main noun, and 大 describes what kind of衣we're talking about, so overcoat in this case. If you think about it, this follows the same pattern as normal phrases do in Chinese. So for example, if you want to say something about an object, for example that it's your ball, you would say 我的球, and 球 here obviously appears on the right, and then you have 我 in front of it. The same is true if you want to say that you have a red overcoat, for example, you would say 红色的大衣. You wouldn't reverse it or something else. It's obvious that the 大衣 is on the right and then that the thing that describes it comes on the left. So it's rather nice to know that about 90% of nouns are formed in this way and follows this pattern. When it comes to verbs, it's the opposite case, of course, because when we have phrases in Chinese, we obviously have the verb before the object. So if you're going to say, I don't know, eat lunch, for example, you would say 吃午饭. You put the 午饭 after 吃, you don't say 午饭吃 or something like that. So the natural standard word order in Chinese is to have the verb coming before the object. So in verb compounds, the verb format then appears on the left as we expect. And we also saw this in many of the words we have looked at so far, such as 吃饭, 跳舞, or 睡觉. It's rather interesting to look at the distribution of words and how the composition of these words relate to the type of word it is. So in the written article on Hacking Chinese, I have included a table from Huang 1997, which analyzes the structure of these words. And here we can clearly see that most nouns are composed of two nouns. So most noun compounds consist of two parts, where each part is a noun. And then we also have several other types of nouns, but as you can see, if you look at the table, most of them still have a noun on the right. They might have a verb on the left, or they might have an adjective or something on the left, but usually they do have a noun on the right. And if you look at verbs, it's the opposite, i.e. that most verbs occur with a verb format on the left and then something else on the right. It can be another verb, it can be another noun, or it can be something else. But there is almost always a verb on the left. So in order to get a better understanding of how these compounds work, we're now going to look at how the meaning of each of the components relate to each other. And we're going to do so first with nouns and then later with verbs. So we're going to look at examples from the category of nouns that consist of two nouns. And these examples are from Packard 2000. And if you want a full list, you can check the book, of course, but I also included more examples in the written article. Here I will just mention one per category. So first we have compounds where the first noun is a place where the second noun operates or is located. So a good example might be 手表, wristwatch. Then we have compounds where the second noun indicates a medical condition of the first. So for example, if you want to say pneumonia in Chinese, it's 肺炎. And this is pretty simple because 肺just means lung and 炎 means inflammation, whereas pneumonia in English is a pretty difficult word. Next, we have the first noun depicting the form of the second noun. So, for example, 砂糖 is granulated sugar, and, well, this type of sugar has the same format as sand, so that's why we have 砂糖. Next, we have the second noun depicts the form of the first noun. So, for example, 雪花, snow plus flower, means snowflake. Next, we have noun number 2 is used for noun number 1. So, for example, 机场. So that's machine plus field, airport. Next, the first noun describes where the second noun lives. So, for example, 水鸟 means water bird, literally, or aquatic birds. Next, the second noun is caused by the first noun. So 水灾, for example, where 水 means water and 灾 means disaster. So that would be flood, a disaster caused by water. Next, the second noun is a container for the first noun. So for example, 茶杯 means teacup. So a cup where we have tea, obviously. Next, we have compounds where the second noun is produced by the first noun. So for example, 鸡蛋. So that means chicken plus egg, and that means chicken egg, and normally just egg, of course. So that would be a dan produced by a 鸡. Next, we have compounds where the second noun is made from or composed of the first noun. So for example, most types of meat have the animal that it's made of, so to speak, and then the word for meat. So 猪肉 would be pig plus meat or pork. And this is another example where it's much easier in English. We don't have to learn that pork is a specific type of meat because 猪 is of course included in the word. Then we also have compounds where the first noun is a type or subclass of the second noun. So for example, this is true for many flowers and many fruits and so on, and many plants in general. And we have 兰花, for example, which means orchid plus flower, so orchid flower. And in English we just say orchid, but in Chinese it's nice to see that we have hua in most of these. Next, we have the first noun being a metaphorical description of the second noun. So, for example, 银行 means silver plus business, and that would be a bank. And of course, it's not necessarily something with silver, and silver here is used metaphorically to mean money. Next, we can also have compounds where the second noun is the source of the first noun. So, for example, a 电池 is electricity plus pool, so that would be a battery. Next, we have the opposite, i.e. where the first noun is the source of the second noun. So, for example, 海盐 means sea plus salt, and it means salt coming from the sea, so sea salt. So just as a reminder here, remember that we're talking about noun plus noun compounds here, and the noun format is usually on the right. So for example, 电池, it is a reservoir of what? Electricity. And the same thing with 海盐 for sea salt. It is salt. What kind of salt? It's sea salt. Okay, moving on. So noun number 2 is something that noun number 1 has or contains. So for example, 房顶 means house plus top, and that means roof. So the ding here is part of the fang, and that's how we say roof in Chinese. Next, we have the opposite of that, so that's when the first noun is something that the second noun has or contains. So for example, 名片 is name plus strip, or that's a business card or a name card. I think most of the examples we've gone through so far are fairly intuitive if you know the characters. So again, note that by knowing the characters, all these things kind of make sense, at least from a certain point of view. Whereas if you haven't spotted the patterns of how the components fit together here, this can be rather tricky to remember, especially the order here, but we will get back to that later. Before we get into verbs, there are a few extra kinds of nouns that are useful to be aware of, and that's where the parts mean essentially the same thing. And you might have seen this in the word 墙壁, for example, which means wall, and both the components also mean wall, and this is just a way of forming this type of word. Another common example is 森林 for forest, where both characters also mean forest. And we also have 眼睛, which means eye, and both these characters also mean eye. Finally, there is also a class of compounds where both components are members of a class, and then by putting them together, you're not referring to these specific instances, but rather the larger class. So for example, 山水, mountain plus water, means scenery, and of course mountains and water are just part of the scenery, but they are used to represent the whole category. So let's talk a little bit about verbs, and here I'm using the classification that Packard uses. So we have 3 different types of verb compounds. First, we have verb plus verb compounds, and those would be a little bit similar to the noun plus noun compounds we looked at before. But we also have something called resultative verbs, and then we also have verb plus object compounds, which we also have discussed in this and the previous article. So let's look briefly at each of these without getting bogged down into too much detail. So when it comes to verb plus verb compounds, which is the biggest category, we have many cases where they mean the same thing. So maybe the most common example here is 讨论, and 讨 and 论 both mean discuss separately, and together they also mean discuss. Another example you might have stumbled upon is 阅读, and 阅 and 读 both mean to read, and 阅读 also means to read. This is part of what I was talking about last time when we talked about the dual vocabulary in Chinese, that you can say do something, but you can also use 阅读, which is a kind of 2-syllable version of the same word. Next, we have verb plus verb compounds, where each component refers to a specific activity, and yet the whole word doesn't just refer to a general category, but these 2 specific activities in question. So, for example, we have 叫醒, which means to wake up, or literally it's to call and wake up. So this is 2 separate steps, like you call someone in order to wake them up, or to be awakened by calling, as it were. Finally, we also have some verbs which follow a similar structure to what we talked about when it comes to the nouns before. So the first one describes the second one. So for example, 飞行 means to fly, and 飞 means to fly on its own, and 行 means to just go in general. So fly is then specifying which kind of going we're talking about, i.e. flying in this case. So those were verb plus verb compounds. We then also have resultative verbs, and this is something that I think is better discussed in an article or podcast episode about grammar in general. So I will just mention a few examples here so you know what it's about, but I will not go into detail here. So for example, we can say 吃饱, as in to eat and get full. We can say 吃得饱 to indicate that you can do this, and you can also say 吃不饱 to indicate that you have eaten, but that the result was not that you are 饱. We can also use directional words such as 上 and 下 to modify verbs or give the result, so 走下来, as in to walk down from somewhere, maybe a building or something. And we can also have resultatives that show attainment. So for example, 看到 to see and actually see something, or 看得到 as in you can see something, or 看不到 as in that you cannot see it. But like I said, I think these things belong in an article or podcast about grammar specifically, so I will leave this for later. The third category of verbs that I listed above is verb-object compounds, And this is an interesting topic for discussion because it is indeed difficult to figure out what is a word here and what is a phrase. But we already talked about that in the previous episode, and I don't think that these are particularly tricky for learners, so we're not going to talk about them more right now. We are instead going to talk a little bit about reversible words. And this is something that is sometimes made a lot of, and as in indicating that it's something that might be difficult. But usually I don't think that words that can be reversed, i.e. words that have components that can appear in both orders, they usually aren't that difficult. There are some tricky cases we will look at, but in general it is quite easy, provided that you understand what I've talked about so far in this and the previous episode. So let's look at an example, ya shua versus shua ya. And one of them means toothbrush and the other means to brush one's teeth. And here beginners might sometimes stumble and don't remember which one is which. But if you know what we've talked about here, this is actually quite easy, and it's also exactly the same as in English, so I'm not sure why people find that these reversible words are sometimes hard, because ya shua is ya, that's tooth, and shua, brush. And we know that the noun form should be on the right in nouns. So ya shua is a brush. What kind of brush? A toothbrush. And then for shua ya, we have the verb format on the left. So it is brushing teeth. And if you know about the ordering here, there is no way you can reverse this because obviously ya shua, a toothbrush, it's not a tooth of some kind. It is a brush. So you have to have the brush on the right. Another example that I used for the cover image of this episode is feng mi versus mi feng. And this is something that I got tripped up in the beginning. I don't remember exactly why, and it's a little bit weird in hindsight. But if you think about it, the logic here is perfectly clear because as in English, you can even say this in English and it works. Feng mi means bee honey, literally. And it also means honey. And we can say bee honey in English as well if you want to refer to honey that comes from bees. And then we have mi feng, and that means honey plus bee. And we can say that in English too. We have honeybees, right? And that is a bee, obviously. It's not honey. So the ordering here is the same as in the Chinese language in general, and we have the main format on the right. So if it is mi on the right, that must be honey, and if it's feng on the right, well, then it's a bee. Now, I have, of course, chosen examples that make sense here, but like I've said, most of the time, say 90% of the cases, nouns are structured in a certain way and so on. That doesn't mean that it always makes sense or that all cases are easy, and we're going to look at a few ones here that can trip you up. And the point here is that you can use the patterns to figure out how the language works and make it easier to learn, but you can't use these patterns to predict exactly how a word behaves, because languages are arbitrary by nature and there will always be lots of exceptions. So let's look at a few of them. So 地道 versus 道地. So if you look these up in a dictionary, they will say the same thing. They mean authentic or original, maybe pertaining to a specific area or region. So 地道, yeah, 地道 also means tunnel, but then you have a fourth tone on the dao, so 地道, but that's irrelevant here. So what is the difference between these? Well, it turns out to be mostly a regional thing, where in mainland China people tend to say 地道, and in Taiwan people use 道地. And this is not related to the internal structure of the word itself or something like that, so it's just something you have to learn. It's not something you can really figure out in advance. Another common example I think many of you have encountered is the difference between 适合 and 合适. So these are the same characters but reversed. And here they also mean the same thing. They seem to mean something suitable, appropriate, and so on. But the difference is mostly in how they are used syntactically in a sentence. So for example, you can say 这件衣服很合适, meaning that a piece of clothing is appropriate or suitable, so it's more akin to an adjective here. Whereas 适合 is used as a verb that usually requires an object after it. So you can say 这件衣服很适合你, so you need to add that 你 at the end. But this is obviously not something you can figure out just by looking at the characters and trying to analyze their structure. So how do you deal with cases like this? Well, of course, you do what you do in all other cases. You read and listen more. Vast amounts of exposure with a small seasoning of theoretical understanding is the way to go. Okay, so all that was a pretty long discussion about compound nouns and verbs in Mandarin. We do also have some other categories that I promised to go through, and that were the free plus bound morpheme version, where you have a root and then some kind of suffix. And maybe the most obvious one, the one that most beginners see first, is the 字 one we talked about earlier. So 桌子, for example. The 字 here doesn't mean anything. The character on its own used to mean 子 as in child, and it still means that with a third tone. But this 字 here doesn't mean anything, it's just appended to some nouns. Then we have a word like 学, which is added to various things to show that it's a field of study or a school of some kind maybe. So we have, for example, 数学, which would mean number plus study, so that's mathematics. We have 化学, or the study of change, so that would be chemistry. And 小学 would be elementary school. Then we also have a number of suffixes that turn something into a noun. So, for example, 度, which means degree, which can be used as a suffix to turn something into a noun then. So, for example, we have 速度, which would mean the degree of fast, i.e. speed. Then we have examples like 难度, which would be degree of difficult, i.e. difficulty. And there are more suffixes like this. We have 化, for example, that indicates change of some kind. So 老化 would be aging, 现代化 modernization, 内化 internalization, and so on. We also have more suffixes like 字 that don't really mean anything but need to be appended in certain cases. So, for example, 头 means head normally, but it can also be applied in certain words, and then it doesn't mean anything. So, for example, 木头 means wood. And mu, of course, means wood on its own as well. This toe here doesn't mean anything, and it's a neutral tone normally. We also have words like 舌头, which means tongue. And this doesn't mean the head of the tongue or something like that. It just means tongue, and this toe here doesn't really mean anything. We also have a large set of suffixes that are used for people of different kinds, and these can be rather confusing sometimes. For example, we have yuan as in 店员, which would be shop assistant. We have 家 as in 作家, which means author. We have 者 as in 记者, which means journalist. We have 生 as in 学生, which means student. Then we have 师 as in 老师 or 律师, which means teacher and lawyer respectively. And then finally, sometimes we just use 人, for example in 军人, which means soldier. And it can be rather tricky to figure out which of these is which and when you're supposed to use them. And again, you need to read and listen a lot to learn this, because this is just sometimes rather arbitrary. You could say, for example, that 师, as in 老师, refers to a master or a teacher of some kind. Then you can also say that 生 means student, but this doesn't really make sense on the individual case level, because if you as a student encounter the word 医生, which means doctor, well, you can say that a doctor is a person who studies the field of medicine, that's fine, but why is that different from, say, a 律师 or a 厨师, like a lawyer or a cook? Are they more masters than doctors are, and are they not also students of their respective fields? Anyway, there is no way you can figure this out in advance. You cannot predict this, you just have to learn it. We also have some suffixes that are more in the realm of grammar. So, for example, we have a plural particle or a collective noun particle, the men. So, for example, in 我们 and 你们 and so on. And then we have the particles that we all love, such as 了, 过, and 着, and so on. But I think that these are more in the realm of grammar, and this episode is already quite long enough, so I'm not going to talk about them today. In the next category, we have a bound morpheme plus a free morpheme, so if you will, that's a prefix with a root following after it. These are not as common, so I will just bring up a few examples. You have probably noticed that Chinese people use 小 and 老 in front of surnames, for example, to create nicknames. So we have 小林 or 老张 or something like that. And these work as familiarity markers, so you use this with someone you know well, and usually you use 小 when the person is younger than you are, and 老 when the person is older. Now, this is not always the case, of course, for these prefixes. For example, we can have 老 in animal names, such as 老虎 or 老鼠. And here it doesn't mean old, and it's not a mark of familiarity either, it just happens to be like that. Maybe this is again related to the preference of having two-syllable words. And for other animals, we have other ways of doing this. So, for example, a rabbit is a 兔子, and there is no way you can know that 老鼠 happens to use 老 in front of it, whereas 兔子 uses 字 after it. And some animals don't use anything, so you can say 牛, for example, just on its own. And like I said, there is no way to predict this, so this is something you learn by reading and listening. Naturally, 小 works the same way, so you can use 小 in ways where it just means small too, so 小菜, for example, or 小孩. I also mentioned other prefixes before, such as 初, meaning the beginning or the first of something. We have 第, that means number something, or the first is 第一, for example, and this can be a prefix that indicates ordinal numbers then. Finally, we have a category of words that contain two bound morphemes, and we already talked about examples. We had båli for glass and hodia for butterfly, for example. Here we can also include loan words because those can't be made sense of just by looking at the characters, right? We talked about this in the previous episode as well. So for example, cafe, you cannot understand this word by looking at ka and then at fe because you are looking in the wrong place. It looks like that because it's a loan word from another language. Still, even though the characters don't contribute any meaning in this case, you can still use the meaning of characters to help you remember the order and which characters should be used in a certain word, of course. So this episode is already much longer than I intended, so let's round it off by looking at an overview of how this can help you learn Chinese. And it should be fairly clear by now that first you learn the building blocks. And when I say first here, I don't mean that you only learn building blocks and then you go to step 2. It's just a way of structuring the principles here. So you learn the building blocks, and in this case that would be the individual characters. Then you connect them together using logic by understanding how they work, which makes it much easier, or mnemonics, or both. And I'm not going to talk about mnemonics in this article. I will probably return to that topic more in a future episode. But in the meantime, you can search for mnemonics on Hacking Chinese, and I've written several articles about that already. And then when you have these, you will always have to upgrade and fix things that don't stick. I mean, I forget characters these days, and I need to go in and look at my understanding of the characters and of the words and how I have put them together. Then, when you've done all these things, you can learn new words really, really quickly. And I performed a rather unscientific experiment with myself as the only participant 10 years ago now, but I still thought I'd share the results with you here because they are related to trying to learn as many words as quickly as possible. So I went through a list of fairly advanced vocabulary and found that there were around 2,000 words that I didn't know. And at this point I was preparing for a test, so I thought that passively knowing these words for reading purposes would be beneficial. And it turned out to be, but I'm just explaining why I try to cram in 2,000 words as quickly as possible, which is normally not the kind of thing you want to do. Anyway, I learned about 400 words per day for 5 days, and it took around 3 hours per day. So that's about 2 words per minute. I did know most of the characters in advance. I knew about the principles I talked about in this article and so on, and this is why this actually turned out to work quite well. I used spaced repetition to make sure that I actually learned the words over the long term, at least for a month in this case, and I was able to learn 90 to 95% of the words. Of course, I'm not telling you this to boast. I'm saying that if you use all the principles that I've talked about here, if you know your characters, learning words is actually quite easy, and I'm sure that most people can do what I did if they really want to. And I understand most people don't want to spend that much time in such a short period, but you get my point. I should also say that the goal here was to learn these words passively so that when I read, I could then gradually absorb how they were used, what they meant with more nuance, and so on. The goal was not to learn these words so that I can use them actively. Anyway, what I hope I have conveyed to you today is that when you know the principles and when you know the building blocks, learning Chinese words is actually quite easy. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.